but he's been active with folks and the physicians in the Finger Lakes, and he's a great resource to us when we have an injured patient, an injured person, a child. He does have an active clinical practice in concussion management. I'm going to let you listen to him, as he is one of the leaders in concussion research, and he's going to talk to you about the latest and greatest concussions. And it's our pleasure. Please, a warm welcome for Dr. Jeff Bazarian.
Well, I think I'll have to move out from behind that podium because I can't see my slides. I know, like Ray, who obviously had all the slides memorized. I don't have my slides memorized. But I have to say, Ray, every time I hear you speak, I say, why bother having me come up to speak after you speak? That was just such an amazing talk. I feel like I need to give you a round of applause. I also want to thank Senator Nozzolio for making life a lot easier for those of us who take care of people who have been concussed. This concussion law has really raised awareness, and I know there's lots of athletic trainers here I bet would agree with me. It really has made things a lot easier. Okay, so I'm out in front of the podium. I know I'm in dangerous territory here, but so just keep eating while I talk. I wanted to spend the next few minutes talking about some of the really cool research developments in concussion research. I think this should give us all hope that we're going to be able to do a better job at diagnosing concussion and treating it and preventing bad things from happening down the line. And I also want to spend a minute talking about the topic that Ray touched on, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. There's been some movement in that area there, so I wanted to spend a minute talking about this. Now, this is not really set up for you guys to ask questions while I'm roaming around here. And as Jason said at the end of our talks, I think we're going to have a little panel discussion, so you guys have had a chance to digest your food. The four of us will come up here, and then you can have at us, ask questions. So, but I would not discourage you from asking questions. Just don't choke on whatever it is you're eating while you're trying to ask a question. Okay, so the next few minutes, here's what I want to talk about: how we can detect concussions better and treat them, and a little bit about CTE. All right. Now, concussions are not easy to diagnose. Anybody who's ever tried to do this knows that it's really, really tough. Yes, you can have somebody who's knocked out like this player here. That's pretty straightforward. But if you're looking for someone to come forward to you and tell you that they had a period of amnesia or confusion or a headache, a lot of you know that athletes don't like to come forward with those pieces of information and tell folks about this. Because they get pulled out of whatever contest they're in. So, here's a guy with a headache. Maybe you can tell by looking at him. If you have a really good trainer like this redheaded guy over here, who you're going to hear from in a minute, Jeffrey. Yes, maybe a really good trainer can pick up on it that an athlete ain't acting right. But it's not easy. You're asking someone with a brain injury to tell you whether they've had a brain injury, to tell you the symptoms, and do they remember having a brain injury. And I always thought that was kind of odd, that we're asking the person with the brain injury to help us diagnose their brain injury. Now, I don't think that's going to work. And you know what? It doesn't. It really doesn't work. So unless you are really astute, a lot of these concussions get missed. And we have some other issues as well. There are things that actually make it hard for us to know whether someone who's hit their head may have had a concussion or something else. Like, take this nice young freshman at the University of Rochester who's studying late on a Friday night, has a little too much to drink, hits his head, doesn't remember. Does he not remember because he was intoxicated or because he had a brief loss of consciousness from getting hit? Can't tell, right? Little kids jumping on the bed, pre-verbal, they can't speak, they hit their head, mom's not around, dad's not around. You got to ask a pre-verbal child, did you have a brief period of amnesia or confusion? They can't tell you, right? Here you have somebody who maybe has a seizure disorder, who hits their head in the process of seizing. Well, a seizure will wipe out your memory too. So is their memory wiped out because they had a concussion or because they had a seizure? Can't tell. And then you got the bigger problems of athletes who are just going to straight up lie to you and not tell you. And the same thing goes for our folks in uniform too. They have a real legitimate reason not to want to tell someone that they've had a concussion because they know they get pulled out of their unit and they don't want to put their buddies at risk. But we have a problem here because if someone's had a concussion, they might not be aiming their weapon correctly or responding appropriately, and paradoxically could put their service member, their colleagues at risk. So we got problems all along the line here. So, we have no real objective aid to this diagnosis. We're kind of just asking people to tell us. And what we got is a series of problems. One, we have patients who have a concussion, well, we label them as having a concussion, but really there's nothing wrong with them. And then we have the opposite problem. We have people that probably have some injury to their brain who escape a diagnosis of concussion. And the problem is that both of these problems have really got us to where we are in 2013, which is that we don't really have a whole lot to offer concussion people because we don't have an accurate way to diagnose them. Well, that's going to change. That's changing. Okay, so here's what's changing. I think coming very soon to an emergency department near you, blood tests to diagnose concussion. So believe it or not, blood tests can diagnose heart attacks, blood tests can diagnose liver failure. Pretty soon we'll have a blood test to diagnose concussion. So there's a way for proteins in your brain to find their way into the blood. Unfortunately, they got to get through this gate. There's this gate between the blood and the brain. It's called the blood-brain barrier. But lucky for us, if you get hit hard enough, that gate opens up. It's like 2 for 1. You get a little brain injury, the gate opens up, and proteins that get released from the brain injury actually find your way into your vein, where we can measure it, pick it up. And there's been a variety of brain proteins, believe it or not, that have already been studied. Brain proteins. Here's the whole list of them. This one at the top has received the most attention. It's called S100B. It's just, doesn't mean anything except it's a brain protein. And it's pretty good at diagnosing a lot of problems related to concussion. It's so good, how good is it? It's so good that it actually can predict when someone has some bleeding in their brain from a concussion. Anybody remember this guy, Brandon McCarthy? He's a pitcher for the A's. Last year was hit in the head by a line drive. There he is right there. He had this epidural hematoma. Thankfully, someone picked it up without this blood test and operated on him, and he's doing fine. This doesn't happen very frequently, but when it happens, you want to know, because if you operate on them, you can save their life. This blood test can pick that up. A simple blood test can be used to decide whether someone who's had a concussion needs a CAT scan. And it's so good that there's lots of countries in the world that use this blood test, but ours ain't one of them. So it's used in all these countries here. This is a care plan from an emergency department in Munich that uses S100B. If you go to Oktoberfest and get hit in the head, I don't know how that would happen, but if it happens and you go to their emergency room, they're going to do this blood test before they decide whether you need a CAT scan or not. So it's out there, it's used, it just ain't here yet. And there's lots of groups trying to get the FDA to pass this. But that would make life a lot easier. And one day someone will invent a little sideline point-of-care test device so we could check this blood test on a football field, on a soccer field, in an ambulance. We don't have to go to a hospital. We can do it like in this swimmer. This swimmer's getting his blood sugar checked. But it's the same idea. A whole point-of-care test device to check to see whether someone's had a brain injury. This is the size, this is the device that's used to measure it right now. It's like a desktop printer. You're not going to put that on the sideline. But these are devices that are available right now to measure other proteins, not brain proteins. It's out there. So we just got to adapt these, and we could be using this tomorrow. Okay, let me switch from blood tests to brain imaging. Everybody knows that you can't see concussion on a CAT scan, right? Right? I hope there's going to be a test afterwards. Everybody knows you can't see concussion on a CAT scan. A lot of people will get a CAT scan to look for bleeding, not for the injury to the brain. It's for bleeding. You can't see that in an MRI either. So neither of those tests are helpful for concussion. I don't know if Ray, you probably underwent some of these things, right? Yeah. But there is a new form of MRI called diffusion tensor imaging. And it looks just like an MRI scanner. I call it MRI on steroids because it looks just like it. It just deals with the information a lot differently, such that you can actually see the injury to the brain after concussion. And this is one of the patients we studied, a Rochester High School football player. We had a scan before and after concussion on him, and we could actually see where the injury was to his brain. This test is so sensitive that it actually picks up injury after blows to the head that don't cause a concussion. Just playing football for a season, we can see some injury to the brain without any concussion at all. That's how sensitive it is. It's not quite ready for prime time yet, but it's close. Okay, this is one of my favorite new technologies to help us diagnose concussion. You know how athletes like to lie about whether they've had a concussion or not? This can maybe help. Helmet sensors. Riddell has a system where they have fitted in the helmet these accelerometers. Basically these little sensors that can tell someone on a sideline with a laptop right here how many times the player's been hit and how hard they were hit. So you could then pull a player out if they had a real bad hit and test them and see whether they're okay. We have 40 University of Rochester players wearing this right now. So my coordinator has to monitor 40 people at one time, and one of my coordinators is actually sitting over here. Keon has to do that as well. And it's actually the task is made easy by the software. So if someone has a real hard hit, you don't have to ask the athlete, you just pull them out and test them. And there are several schools that are using this, Stanford, Virginia Tech, but we've got it going in Rochester as well. So it takes a little bit of the guesswork out. Now it's not diagnosing concussion, it's just telling you that someone got hit pretty hard. You have to be the ones to figure out whether they have a concussion or not. But if this is telling you that person had a hit, get them out and check them out. Okay, so now how do we detect concussion in a way that doesn't rely on talking to the athlete? Here's a really interesting new product. And this thing is called an eye tracker. And it relies on the fact that someone who's had a concussion, their attention is not so good. All right, they can't attend as well as someone who hasn't had a concussion. So if you ask them to look at these glasses, and on the inside of the glasses, they have to follow this yellow ball going around in a circle. They kind of are not so good at following that yellow ball because their attention is off. And their eye kind of lags behind that yellow dot. And the glasses actually shine a camera on the eye. It's pretty cool. So we can see that the eye is not keeping up with that ball. So it says, you can say, oh, your eye's not keeping up, you've had a concussion. It takes 2 seconds. Put it on, have them follow the light around, boom. It's being used by the military in Afghanistan and Iraq now. It hasn't found its way into civilian use yet. Okay, Ray, you mentioned having several EEGs in your life. So as Ray said, the EEG, the brain electrical activity, is a little off after concussion. Not like you're having a seizure, but it's just a little off. The only way you know is if you did an EEG. And Ray probably remembers they probably stuck like 55 different electrodes on your head. Not something you could do on the sideline. Well, this company developed a really neat portable device. It's like a band you put around your head. It's got 5 little sensors on it, and it sends the electrical activity to this box that looks like the thing the FedEx guy has you sign when you drop off a package. And all you have to do is close your eyes for 5 minutes, and this box has a computer in it. It'll tell you whether your brainwave looks more like a concussed person or a normal person. 5 minutes? Is it 5 or 10? Yeah. 5 minutes. Eyes closed. Boom. It can tell you concussion, no concussion. All you got to do is be able to close your eyes, not move it. That one is being close to being rolled out. Say that again? Right. Okay, now, I told you if someone had a hard hit, you'd want to test them see whether they had a concussion. Well, some of you know about this computer program called Impact, right? It's a computer program to see how someone's brain is working. It's, you know, it's a desktop or a mouse. Well, the company actually has an iPhone app, so you could do this on the sideline. So if someone had a hit, and you wanted to know right then and there how was their brain working, you could give them the scat, which is really kind of cumbersome, or have them do Impact right there on the sideline. Right? It's a little sideline version right out here. Now the only problem with this is, you know, you're outside, crowds yelling, lights, bright lights. It's not really a distraction-free environment. So another company came up with a device called the DTEC system, which is kind of like Impact, only totally immersive. Here's one of our U of R football players. He's got, I don't know if you can see that, but he's got this goggle and headphone system on, and he's got a controller pad that basically is showing him into the goggles a cognitive test. And in 12 minutes, he can totally immerse. He can't hear the crowd, he can't see the sun, he can't see his his colleagues running around the field. He's basically taking the cognitive test right there, totally immersed. So that's a really neat way to know whether someone who's had a big hit to the head, is their brain working right, yes or no, so that we can avoid sending them back too soon. Kind of cool. Okay, those are some of the latest ways to detect concussion. I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the latest ways to treat concussion. Now, as all you know, when someone's had a concussion, you're not supposed to have them do anything. They're supposed to rest, right? They're supposed to rest and not do anything. Well, it looks like that's good for a short period of time, but not for a long period of time. If you have them do that for a long period of time, bad things happen. So our colleagues down the thruway in Buffalo figured this out, that if you get people up and get them moving, they actually get better quicker. If you have them exercise in a really structured way, they get better quicker than if you just have them sit in a dark room. I'm sorry, I have my back to you. So you have to have someone hooked up to a heart rate monitor. You have to do this in a really precise way. You just can't do it willy-nilly. And if we do this in a highly structured way, if someone work up to the point where they get a headache and then exercise below that, they get better quicker than if they do nothing at all. So that's a pretty new thing. Exercise to actually make this injury better faster, rather than having them do nothing. But it's got to be done under supervision. A week. You have them rest for a week and then boom. Yep. So the question was, how soon can you start that? A week. This is the answer. Okay. There actually is a medication out there that looks like it helps with some of the cognitive issues that our athletes have with concussion. Ray, you mentioned having some of those problems as well. That's a really common problem, not being able to concentrate, poor attention. This medication looks like it does a pretty good job in improving concentration after concussion. It's called amantadine. Some of you may recognize this. It's an old medication. It's an antiviral medication, and it used to be used to treat Parkinson's a long, long time ago. But one of its side effects is it's a neurostimulant. It's actually a pretty decent neurostimulant. And it's much better tolerated than Ritalin and Adderall and some of those medications. Very nice studies showed that cognition did really improve when athletes took this pill. It's one pill twice a day, and it really seems to work. So that's something that we never had in our armamentarium before to help us get our athletes feeling better, getting back to school, getting back to doing the things that they want to be able to do. All right, now here's a really unique idea, hyperbaric oxygen. I put this up here because I wanted to show you something that absolutely does not work. So that you can see, there's a couple things that work. This absolutely does not work. The idea is, like, you super saturate the amount of oxygen going into someone's brain, it's going to juice up those mitochondria and really help the brain recover. And you know, there's NFL players that have gone out and gotten these hyperbaric chambers, right? And they have them in their house. Yeah, they just sit in there after they've had a concussion. Well, lots of evidence that it doesn't work. This is actually one of my patients who didn't believe me and went and did it anyway, and it didn't work. So you're going to hear about this. There's no evidence that it works. It's kind of sexy. You know, the guy looks like he's about to go into hyperwarp space, but it doesn't it doesn't really, unfortunately, it doesn't help. It helps with other things like tissue healing, wound healing, but not with concussion. Okay, I'd like to say a few words about traumatic encephalopathy. And I think Ray gave an excellent introduction to this. There's been an increased awareness that this is a problem that affects professional athletes. And many of you recognize some of these sport figures here that were diagnosed with CTE. Currently, the only way to diagnose that is on a post-mortem examination of the brain. We think there might be some link between what happens to athletes acutely and this, and we're trying to understand what those links are and how to interrupt it. So we don't go from a football player playing at the University of Rochester or Brighton High School to someone who has CTE. And what CTE looks like on pathology is a lot of brown stuff. This is a normal brain. It looks all nice and white and a little bit of purple. This is all brown stuff. It's called tau. And this is a protein that forms some of the neurons in the brain, but it's not supposed to be all clumped up like this. And when the neurons get injured, the tau just flows out and forms these clumps and basically poisons all the cells around them. It's like a poison to the brain. So here's a boxer, and here's an NFL linebacker. Their brains don't look too dissimilar. And I think that this was kind of a revelation that the brains of football players kind of look like the brains of folks who had dementia pugilistica. They were very similar indeed. And there's an interesting history of this. Prior to 2009, there were only 49 cases of CTE, which the other term is dementia pugilistica. And most of them were boxers, but there were some interesting other folks that had it. There was some people who had they were headbangers, autistic people that kind of pathologically banged their head. There was a clown, a circus clown, one part of his act was to jump into a garbage can head first every day in the circus. So repetitive injury to the head was prior to 2009, that's what we got. Now since 2009, though, there's been 85 cases reported by primarily two groups. One at Boston University that Ray mentioned, and the other group is in West Virginia, Bennett Amalia's group. Well, between those two groups, 85 cases, guess what? 95% of them are athletes. But look at this age range, 16. They have a couple people in their database that are 16, 17, 18 years old. So this is not just a 40, 50, 60-year-old thing. Here's one of he's an 18-year-old, CTE, diagnosed with CTE, played football in Pittsburgh. He was featured in Rolling Stone magazine last year. And this is the team at BU that Ray talked about. This is Cantu, Bob Cantu is a neurosurgeon, and Ann McKee is a pathologist. So this is not just something that affects people in their 30s and 40s. It can affect young people as well. The most common sport, football, and hockey, boxing, a little bit of wrestling. All right, so the $17,000 question. Why do some athletes that hit their head a lot have no problem, normal brains, but others develop CTE? Why is that? Well, the answer is we don't know, but we've got some ideas. It seems clear that hitting your head multiple times is part of the problem, and it's not just concussion. Some of these athletes in the database who have CTE said they never had a concussion. So there's something to do with hitting your head a lot. That's a problem. But obviously not enough, because there are some people that hit their head a lot that never get CTE. So there's some theories about why that might be. One of them had to do with genetics. So if you have a certain genotype, like for the protein ApoE4, which is a brain protein to help get rid of debris. If you have a good protein, maybe you're okay. If that protein doesn't work so well, maybe you get this. That's one idea. The other idea is much more intriguing though. The other idea has to be that the body actually attacks the brain in the process of getting hit day in and day out. Remember I told you about that gate between the brain and the blood? That gate's supposed to be closed. So there never should be any brain proteins in your blood. But if you get hit playing football 70, 80 times a game, that gate opens up, brain proteins come out into the peripheral circulation, and the body goes, hey, what's this? we don't know this protein, and it starts to attack it. So it forms antibodies against this protein because it's never seen it before. The next time that gate opens up with the next hit, that antibody goes like a heat-seeking missile. Where does it go? Back to the brain. So it goes back and attacks the brain. And the way the brain of someone with CTE looks, it looks like an autoimmune degenerated brain. So one of the theories is that this is kind of an autoimmune process, that the body learns to attack brain proteins because this gate keeps opening up, releasing small amounts of brain protein, teaching the body, go attack the brain. That's a theory, but that's kind of one of the leading theories now. How do we interrupt that? How do we know more about that? It has yet to be figured out. So there's some tantalizing clues out there. Okay, so I told you a little bit about detection, a little bit about treatment, a little bit about CTE. I could obviously spend all night talking about these things, but I want you guys to finish up your dinner and get to dessert. And I wrote down questions here, but I'd like to thank all the people that work with me. This is not a one-man thing to do this research. I need a lot of people to help. I have the athletic trainer at the University of Rochester, all the athletes, coordinators. And because it is my anniversary today, I do have to also thank my wife for being supportive.
Great job, Dr. Bazarian. Again, thanks for being here. We're going to have questions after the next two speakers. And I'm going to introduce Jeff Bray from Ciancaglini College.